With the 2026 FIFA World Cup in full swing, I thought it'd be fun to take a look at an iceberg with 8 layers and 50 entries of well-known football-related topics, matches, and rules that I think everybody should know, to some of the craziest historical controversies you've likely never heard of. We're talking bribes, assassinations, and even all-out war. Yeah, football can get crazy. But before we get into that, we're starting off with the first entry in Layer 1, and that would be the World Cup. The most watched sporting event in the world by far. The first ever World Cup aired on radio in 1930 with only 16 teams, where 2 withdrew and 1 missed their ship? While there have been other large football competitions before that, this was the first one organized by FIFA, which we'll talk about in just a second. Now, there's been a few notorious World Cups throughout history. Some of them we'll go over later on in this video. The most interesting and by far the coolest thing about the FIFA World Cup is how it's evolved over time, because FIFA has grown from 16 members in 1930 to 211 members in 2026. For those of you who don't understand how crazy that is, the United Nations has 193 members, and there's genuine arguments to be made that football is more unifying than actual diplomacy. The first ever winner was Uruguay in 1930, and the most recent was obviously Argentina in 2022, but there's stiff competition, upsets, and controversy at almost every World Cup. At the time of me recording this video, the 5 countries with the most World Cup wins are Brazil with 5, Germany with 4, Italy with 4, Argentina with 3, and France with 2. The ones are represented with little stars over their badges. Today, the World Cup is a global juggernaut, with the latest World Cup in 2022 having a peak viewership of 1.4 billion people worldwide. No other sporting event in history even comes close. FIFA. Similar to the Olympic Committee setting up the Olympics, the Federation International de Football Association, aka FIFA, is the governing body behind the World Cup. It was founded in 1904 with 8 founding members: Belgium, Denmark, Switzerland, Netherlands, Sweden, France, and Spain. England, however, rejected the invitation due to some classic British pride. After many players returned from World War I, and after some post-war squabble, the first World Cup was held in Uruguay since they were the Olympic football champions, and thus, one of the most respected worldwide traditions was born. However, as an international governing body, you bet your ass that they've been involved in some pretty serious scandals over the years. We'll go over some of those later, but let's just say that FIFA and corruption go together like me and your sister. There's João Havelange, who while serving as FIFA president from 1974 to 1998, received over 40 million euros in bribes for various broadcasting rights. Then, in 1998, when it was time for him to pass the torch to the next FIFA president, either Sepp Blatter or Lennart Johansson, Sepp Blatter ended up buying his way to the presidency, which led to easily the biggest FIFA controversy happening in 2015. What happened, you may ask? Well, keep watching. So yeah, FIFA officials are notoriously corrupt. But what about the current president, Gianni Infantino? Well, aside from cuddling up to the Mango Man, he's also a known tax evader, so there's that, as well as a bunch of other stuff, but we'll talk about that later. Offside. We've all had that one relative who doesn't know anything about football watching the game with you, being totally oblivious to the fact that this is actually not allowed in football. Basically, offside is a rule that regulates how far up on the pitch an attacking player has to be in relation to the last defending player. The rule has actually changed a lot over the years. It started out as having to have 2 defending players, not including the goalkeeper, in front of you when someone passes the ball to you. In 1925, it changed from 2 defending players to 1 player, and in 1990, it changed from being the last defending player to being in line with them. Now, why does this rule even exist, you may ask? Well, for those of you who don't know, the football sport originally started out as an offshoot of rugby. But as time went on, people started to realize that the original rule from the 19th century made the game very stiff. And so over time, the rule eventually loosened up a little bit, making the game much more dynamic. But with that also came a lot of questionable decisions from the referee, which eventually led to the introduction of VAR. And yeah, you guessed it, We'll talk about VAR later as well. The Champions League. Organized by UEFA, which is the European Football Confederation, it is the most prestigious football club tournament in the world, as well as the second most watched football competition, second only to the World Cup. The Champions League began as the European Cup in 1955, and since then, the tournament has been held every year, making it the most consistent high-level tournament in modern history. Since 1955, there's been several eras of club dominance, with Real Madrid winning the first 5, which is still to this day an unbeatable run. The Italians then took over for a little while in the early 60s with AC Milan and Inter Milan. The Dutch kinda ran the early 70s with Ajax and Feyenoord, followed by 3 consecutive wins for Bayern Munich. England was dominating throughout the mid-70s and early 80s, specifically Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. This was then followed by 30 years of pretty tough competition, with AC Milan and Real Madrid being the 2 standouts. There was also a name shift in 1992, officially making it the Champions League. We are currently living through a pretty dominant Spanish time period, with Real Madrid taking home the trophy more times than any other club. Now, even though Spanish clubs like Real Madrid or Barcelona are often considered some of, if not the best clubs throughout history, La Liga is actually not the biggest football league. That title goes to the Premier League. Now, even though the Premier League is not as big as the World Cup or even the Champions League, the Premier League almost single-handedly paved the way for football being the global money machine that it is today. At the start of the 1990s, English football was in a rather tough spot. Not only was hooliganism at its peak, but English clubs had just endured a 5-year ban from European football tournaments after the Heysel Stadium disaster, which was a crowd disaster that happened in 1985 when Liverpool fans rushed down Juventus fans right before the European Cup final. So, at the start of the 90s, the Big Five, aka Arsenal, Man United, Everton, Liverpool, and Tottenham, sold their broadcasting rights to the highest bidder to cover an increasing amount of costs. This started a bidding war over the broadcasting rights, and they were eventually picked up by Sky Sports at a much higher valuation than it had earlier, bringing unseen amounts of advertiser money to the sport. The first game was played in 1992, and since then, those very same broadcasting rights have gone up a lot in value and are now worth a whopping £7 billion. The start of the Premier League and the bidding war over the broadcasting rights that came with it is widely regarded as the single most defining moment in the commercialization of the sport. Since the start in 1992, the Premier League has had its ups and downs with its fair share of iconic moments. Some of them we'll go over later on in this iceberg, but it still remains the largest and most lucrative football league to this day. The GOAT. As with any popular sport, there is bound to be a passionate debate around who the greatest player of all time is. And you know damn well football has one of, if not the most divisive, GOAT debate. There's a lot of players you could go with here. When it comes to defensive players, the names that'll come up the most are probably Maldini, Ramos, and Beckenbauer. When it comes to goalkeepers, it's probably Yashin, Buffon, Neuer, or Casillas. When it comes to midfielders, it's probably Zidane, Iniesta, and Platini. However, the most common answers you'll hear will probably be an attacker of some form. The most common names in this category will be names most people have heard of before: Maradona, Ronaldo, Pelé, and of course, Lionel Messi. But there are so many more names that come up in this debate, like Lothar Matthäus, R9, Neymar, and my personal favorite footballer, Ronaldinho. But again, there are so many great players. Alex Ferguson. Hailed as one of the greatest football coaches of all time, Sir Alex Ferguson, or Fergie, is one of the many reasons why Manchester United was such a force to be reckoned with in the late 90s and early 2000s. Before his career as a football coach, Fergie started out as a player in the early 60s, and was even the Scottish League's top goalscorer in 1965. His career as a manager began in 1974, and he would go on to lead several teams to win the Scottish League Championship, and even a European Cup. In 1986, he got his biggest promotion yet when he was hired as a manager for one of the biggest English football clubs, Manchester United. In a span of 26 years, Fergie's Manchester United would go on to win a whopping 38 trophies, with everything from Premier League titles to FA Cups and even 2 Champions League wins. His career as a manager was so impressive that it even gained the attention of Her Majesty herself, and in 1999, he would be knighted by crucified the Queen, officially becoming Sir Alex Ferguson. When it comes to the greatest coach of all time, there's a few names you'll undoubtedly hear in this conversation, like Ancelotti, Jose Mourinho, and of course, Pep Guardiola. But the fairly unanimous answer to this question will most likely be Alex Ferguson. With his 26-year-long career and winning basically every trophy you could think of, it's very hard to deny his impressive legacy. Layer 2. Man City vs Queen Park Rangers. Say it with me. Aguero! 2023 Women's World Cup. At the height of women's football in 2023, the Women's World Cup had historically high viewership. Not only was it surpassing that of former World Cups, but in certain parts of the world, the viewership was actually competing with the Men's World Cup, something that would have been completely unheard of just a couple years back. The final match was between Spain and England, with Spain coming out on top. Truly a great day for women. But of course, a man has to ruin all of it. During the trophy presentation, when the ladies received their medals, the president of the Spanish Football Federation, Luis Rubiales, proceeded to kiss Spanish midfielder Jenny Hermoso on the lips. And yes, this was completely against her will. The unwanted kiss caused complete outrage, and rightfully so. Now, as it turns out, there were numerous women who before all of this told similar stories of misconduct in the Spanish Football Federation. Stories who were not only swept under the rug, but were also not taken as seriously as they should have once they were brought to light. In the words of legendary Spanish goalkeeper Iker Casillas, this was an embarrassment, and Spain should have spent those days celebrating, not dealing with Rubiales' conduct. And that's really what this all boils down to, in my opinion. Women's football is constantly growing, and unfortunately, there's a lot of men out there who for some reason feel very threatened by that. However, these men do not love football. If you truly love this sport, you should celebrate whenever a record gets broken, regardless of someone's gender, sexuality, or ethnicity. And Luis Rubiales doesn't even respect the sport enough to keep his hands to himself. El Clasico. This is the very famous showdown between two of La Liga's biggest and most well-known football clubs, Real Madrid and Barcelona. It is arguably the most well-known football rivalry of all time, going back as far as 1902. Not only is it an intense showdown between two of the most historically relevant Spanish football clubs, but the match also carries a heavy political connotation. Spain, particularly Barcelona, has a large population of people who identify as Catalans. Not only do Catalans have their own language and culture, but are also heavily contending for Catalonian independence separate from Spain. This fight for independence was particularly contentious during Francisco Franco's dictatorial regime that lasted from the 1930s to the 1970s. Catalans were unfortunately brutally suppressed during this time, and Franco even banned the Catalan language from being spoken in public. El Clasico during this time was very politically charged, with Real Madrid being seen as the more pro-unified Spain club and Barcelona notoriously representing Catalonian independence, a perception that is largely intact even to this day. The showdown itself, however, has had a lot of very memorable and absolutely insane moments. We got Johan Cruyff's absolutely insane goal against Madrid in the early 70s, we got Luis Figo's infamous switch from Barcelona to Real Madrid, with Barca fans seeing this as such a betrayal that they threw a pig's head onto the pitch in sheer outrage. We got Pep Guardiola's 6-2 win for Barca in 2009, with this match being regarded as one of the best team performances of all time. And last but certainly not least, there's the intense rivalry between Messi and Ronaldo that has defined most of, if not all, El Clasico matches throughout the 2010s. It is the most iconic rivalry in the football world, and it's not really even close. Hand of God. In the 1986 World Cup, Diego Maradona's Argentina went up against England in the quarterfinal in a match that will go down in history as arguably the most controversial match in football history. The first half was pretty normal, with some noteworthy attempts, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was really the second half that solidified the controversial legacy of this match. 6 minutes into the second half, Maradona scored a header against goalkeeper Peter Shilton, who was a whopping 8 inches taller than him. How did he do that exactly? Well, Maradona scored with his hand. And not only did he score with his hand, but the goal was actually allowed. Maradona would go on to score another goal after that, and Gary Lineker would end end up scoring a goal for England, with the match ending up a 2-1 victory for Argentina, who would later win the entire World Cup. All because of a little handball. Maradona would later describe the goal as a little with the head and a little with the hand of God, deflecting the clear error while simultaneously calling it divine intervention, and as you can probably guess, this was not very popular with the British. Not to mention the fact that there was already a lot of political tension between Argentina and England during this time. 4 years prior to this, Argentina and England engaged in one of the most brutal wars in modern history. This was over a couple of islands outside the coast of Argentina called the Falkland Islands. The UK would eventually come out on top with hundreds of Argentinians killed, and Maradona would go on to add even more fuel to the fire, calling the hand of God symbolic revenge. Only much later on in 2005 did Maradona admit to the world that the goal was in fact an error. So the hand of God and the fallout that came after is undoubtedly one of the biggest controversies in football history. VAR. A fairly recent addition to the world of football, VAR stands for Video Assistant Referee, and it was implemented to reduce clear and obvious errors made by the referee in important situations. They do this by having a team that watches the match from a wide variety of different angles, and if they spot a potential error, they tell the referee through a little earpiece. The ref can either accept and watch the match footage, or just go on with the rest of the match. VAR is used in 4 different situations: to determine goals, which also includes offside, to determine penalties, red cards, or a mistaken identity. The reason why it's not used all the time is because it is a fairly tedious process that takes up a lot of time, and since the ref very rarely declines the VAR check, there's a lot of people arguing that it slows down the match a little too much. Personally, I believe VAR is definitely here to stay, and even though there's been some controversial VAR decisions, we'll probably never have another hand of God situation again, so that's something, I guess. Galacticos. If you were to ask a football fan what the best team of all time is, the most common answer you'd get back is probably some era of the Real Madrid's Galacticos. First of all, the Galacticos isn't really a team, it's an idea, and it started out in the early 2000s with the newly elected Real Madrid president, Florentino Perez, trying to recruit the best of the best to Real Madrid. To be considered a Galactico, you would not only have to be one of the very best in the world, but also have made a name for yourself in the sport as a whole. From 2000 to 2003, Perez would go on to sign Luis Figo, David Beckham, Zinedine Zidane, and R9. And this, along with many other players, would create the first era of the Galacticos. Now, despite signing some pretty insane names to Madrid, his first era would have somewhat mixed results, at least compared to what you would expect from such a phenomenal team. It would also lead to Perez resigning as president in 2006. But this resignation would not last long, however, and Perez would come back in 2009, and this time he would sign Ronaldo, Kaká, Benzema, Xabi Alonso, and Gareth Bale, along with many other players, and would also appoint Jose Mourinho as manager in 2010. This second era of the Galacticos would be much more successful, and will go on to win 4 Champions League titles with the undisputed best Galactico of all time, Cristiano Ronaldo. Ronaldo would later, as you know, depart for Juventus in 2018, closing out the second Galacticos era. The third era of the Galacticos is undoubtedly the worst so far, and right now it's, well, we'll see how it goes, but it's not looking too good. At least not compared to the previous eras. The Mineirotso. This is considered by many to be the worst loss ever for the nation of Brazil, and the fact that this was played at home makes this loss even worse. In 2014, the World Cup was hosted in Brazil, who would later go head-to-head with Germany in the semi-final, a match that would later go on to be Brazil's most humiliating defeat ever. Before the match even started, you had an injured Neymar and a suspended Thiago Silva, so Brazil was already off to a bad start. The match started out even worse, with Germany scoring within the first 10 minutes, and by the 30th minute, Germany had scored a whopping 5 goals, shattering several records in the process. Germany added 2 more goals in the second half, and Brazil ultimately managed to add 1 goal at the end of the match, but the devastating loss was still very much real. I'm sure you've all seen the videos of players and spectators alike like bursting into tears, and Brazilian newspapers would go on to add fuel to the fire by calling it a historical humiliation. The backlash was so bad that the manager and even several players resigned after the tournament. Football is their national pride after all. This match would later be called the Mineiraço, with the name stemming from the Mineiro, which was the name of the stadium, and Otso, which referred to a similar loss in the 1950s where Brazil lost to Uruguay in the World Cup final on home soil, echoing similar sentiment more than 60 years later. Zidane's headbutt. There are few moments on the football pitch that have reached the same level of scrutiny and controversy as the infamous Zidane headbutt. In the 2006 World Cup final between France and Italy, the score was 1-1. Zinedine Zidane, one of the best players of all time, scored a beautiful Panenka penalty in the 7th minute, and Italy's Marco Materazzi proceeded to equalize in the 19th minute. Now, throughout the match, these two players would exchange blows and words on several occasions. The match was then given extra time, and in the 110th minute, an altercation led to Materazzi allegedly calling Zidane the son of a terrorist whore, which cost Zidane to headbutt him in the chest. Was it deserved? Well, yes. Was it smart? Absolutely not. Because to no one's surprise, Zinedine Zidane was then given a red card, with Materazzi getting off scot-free. France would go on to lose the final in a penalty shootout, and as you could probably imagine, this moment is widely considered to be one of, if not the biggest disgrace that's ever happened on the pitch. Not only was this the last match in his career, but many people blame Zidane for the loss, and it's not hard to see why. If you lose your cool like that, you are giving the provocateur exactly what they want, which is something that should never be rewarded. No one got hurt, so it certainly wasn't the end of the world or anything, and Zidane would later state that he regretted nothing, and if Materazzi's alleged insult is to be believed, then you certainly can't blame him for that. Puskás Award. The most well-known award in the football world is most definitely the Ballon d'Or, meant to celebrate the best player in that given year. An award that is less well-known, however, is the Puskás Award, given out by FIFA meant to honor the late Ferenc Puskás, who is recognized as one of the best goal scorers of all time. The Puskás Award is meant to celebrate the most beautiful or aesthetically pleasing goal in a given year and is voted on by a panel and also registered users on the FIFA website. Ferenc Puskás was no stranger to beautiful goals himself, and this award was created in 2008, just 2 years after his passing. Now, I would love to show you some of the goals, but I can't, because I don't want YouTube to flag the video, but if you haven't seen them, then I highly recommend you do, because some of them are truly astonishing. Cantona's Kung Fu Kick. As I said before, there are few moments on the football pitch that have reached the same level of scrutiny and controversy as Zidane's headbutt. But one of those moments is Eric Cantona's Kung Fu Kick. A moment that is, in retrospect, so absurdly silly that I can't help but laugh. This might be a hot take, but Eric Cantona is a player that popularized the Premier League in many ways. With his iconic bushy eyebrows and hot-headed personality, he created a sort of showmanship in the early days of the Premier League. But the iconic Man United player certainly wasn't perfect by any means. Like with any hot-headed player, he often went way too far, and this moment is certainly one of those times. On January 25th, 1995, when Manchester United went up against Crystal Palace, Cantona was sent off by the referee for kicking. Yes, kicking the Crystal Palace defender Richard Shaw. While he was walking towards the tunnel, he was heckled by Crystal Palace supporter Matthew Simmons. So how did Cantona respond? He proceeded to launch a Kung Fu kick that would make Bruce Lee proud right into the heckler's chest. Let me just play the clip.
Here, Cantona's getting involved with some supporters.
I don't even know what to say. If you thought Zidane's headbutt was bad, Cantona's Kung Fu Kick is Zidane's headbutt on steroids. This landed Cantona a 2-week prison sentence as well as a £10,000 fine, but arguably the biggest punishment he received from this was an 8-month ban from football. Now realistically, even though watching this Kung Fu Kick is really funny nowadays, it's again one of those scenarios where you're letting the agitator win. Matthew Simmons told Cantona to "Go back to France, you French bastard." And even though that's pretty bad, it's in my opinion nowhere near the insult thrown at Zidane. What I'm basically trying to say is, Zidane's headbutt was way more justified. Doping. Even though doping isn't very common in football, as it's a much more team-focused sport than, say, boxing, it's still a utilized practice that still gives you obvious advantages. So there's obviously been a lot of discourse around doping, particularly in the 90s, and especially with Diego Maradona failing a drug test in 1994. But Maradona was on all sorts of substances at the time, so even if this was deliberate, it was still somewhat of an outlier since Maradona wasn't exactly shy about his drug use. But it was still a wake-up call that would result in a gradual increase in drug testing across all high-level play. Another instance that would add to this gradual increase was Juventus being caught in what was essentially a doping scandal after their 1996 Champions League win, where Juventus club doctor would land himself a 22-month prison sentence after giving out performance-enhancing drugs to basically every player in the starting 11, including Alessandro Del Piero and Didier Deschamps. The World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, has cracked down even harder since then, introducing the Athlete Biological Passport in the late 2000s, which tracks the biological markers in an athlete throughout their career. Something to keep in mind here is the fact that players who are or were actively using performance-enhancing drugs usually have a few teammates along for that very same ride, like we saw with Juventus in the 90s. And it's usually very hard to get away with an entire team using them and no one finding out. Miracle of Istanbul. Throughout the history of the Champions League, few matches have been as crazy as the Miracle of Istanbul. In the 2005 Champions League final that took place in Istanbul, Liverpool went up against AC Milan. In the first half of the game, Milan gained a massive 3-0 lead, with Maldini and Crespo being the two scorers. However, Liverpool actually came back, with 3 goals in the second half, and not only that, but they actually ended up winning the match on penalties. This is considered one of the biggest upsets in Champions League history, and if you look at the team lineups, it's not hard to see why. I mean, look at the AC Milan lineup. We got Maldini, Nesta, Cafu, Pirlo, Kaká, Crespo, Shevchenko. I mean, god damn. Then you look at Liverpool's lineup and it's like, they got Gerrard and Xabi Alonso, but that's kinda it. It's one of those once-in-a-lifetime games that has the complete package. Legendary players, an amazing comeback, and just an all-around insane spectacle. Racism. A subject that is unfortunately not taken as seriously as it should be in my opinion, because as we all know, football has always had a racism problem across every country and every league. Racism is unfortunately so unbelievably common that it's frankly impossible to try and tackle all of it in a single entry. The most public displays of racism in football come from England, Italy, and the Balkans, typically in the forms of media slander, verbal abuse, and online harassment. The most recent example that I'm sure we all remember is the targeted racism in 2022 towards Bukayo Saka, Marcus Rashford, and Jadon Sancho after missing their penalties in the Euro 2020 final against Italy. And the amount of racist abuse they subsequently received online was so bad it even caused the Prime Minister to step in and condemn it. In 2018, you had Raheem Sterling targeting the media specifically and exposed the Daily Mail for slandering specifically black players for doing the same thing as white players. However, fans and supporters are unfortunately not the only ones who are racist. There's players too. The two standout examples are Luis Suarez and John Terry. Luis Suarez was accused of racially attacking Patrice Evra in 2011 and later received an 8-match ban as well as a £40,000 fine, which isn't nearly enough in my opinion. Then there's John Terry, who was even taken to court over his racial abuse towards Rio Ferdinand's brother, Anton Ferdinand. And even though John won the case, he was still stripped of the England captaincy and also received a £220,000 fine. And if you think I'm done there, no, that's just England. And England, in the grand scheme of things, isn't even that bad compared to some other countries, because at least England makes sure to sometimes punish people. Countries like Italy are much worse. Mario Balotelli is perhaps the player who has received the most amount of racial abuse publicly, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that he's a black Italian. He's had bananas thrown at him, faced relentless monkey chanting, and what do the Italian newspapers do? They compare him to King Kong. The sport has a long way to go. The 1966 World Cup. The 1966 World Cup is not only historically relevant, but it also holds a very special place in the hearts of the British because despite creating the whole sport, this remains the only time they won the World Cup. But this particular World Cup is renowned for more reasons than that. This was the first World Cup to be broadcasted on color TV, which massively expanded the reach and created a spectacle for not only live viewers at the stadium, but also for people at home. You got the infamous North Korea upset beating Italy and nearly beating Eusebio's Portugal. You got Brazil's early exit in the group stage, and last but not least, you had another sour moment between England and Argentina, where English coach Alf Ramsey called the Argentinians animals. So the relationship between England and Argentina were already pretty bad even at that time. But the biggest controversy from this World Cup was the frequency of rough play, and we'll get back to that later. Ultras. If you have a popular sport, you're bound to have a crazy fan base, and football is no different. In fact, I'd make the brave statement and say football fans are probably the craziest out of any sport, and this is especially true when it comes to the Ultras. Originating in the 1960s in southern Italy, they are described as fanatical fan groups with clear ties to violence and political extremism. They are primarily known, however, for occupying large spaces of an arena, lighting flares, smoke bombs, and are generally associated with football hooliganism. Not every ultra is a hooligan, but every hooligan is an ultra. There's ultras in every country, but Italy, Turkey, and the Balkans are widely considered to have the most radical ultras, with many of them even being linked to organized crime like the mafia. There's been many ultra-related disasters in football, like the Hayes Hill Stadium disaster, which I mentioned earlier, but also some less well-known ones, like the Naples disaster in 1955 that claimed over 100 lives, or the Lima disaster in 1964 that claimed an estimated 300 people. There's also another one, which I'll talk about later. Soccer. I want to make something very clear for all the Americans likely tuning in to the upcoming World Cup. It's football. Thank you. Layer 4. The Women's GOAT. We've talked about the greatest male players of all time, the greatest coach of all time, and now it's time for the greatest female player of all time. The answer to this question is actually fairly unanimous, but I'm willing to bet my entire nutsack that you've probably never even heard of her. Her name is Marta, and she's a Brazilian player with a very impressive list of accomplishments. She is not only Brazil's top goal scorer, but also holds the record for most goals scored in any World Cup with 17, surpassing every woman and every man. She is a 6-time FIFA World Player of the Year, as well as a 3-time Olympic silver medalist. Similar to Ferenc Puskás, Marta has even gotten an award named after her called the Marta Award, which is essentially just the Puskás Award but for women. While there are other players who belong in this conversation like Mia Hamm and Christine Sinclair, Marta is widely considered the GOAT for women, and for good reason. Leicester's 5,000-1 title. I think a lot of people remember Leicester's insane run in 2015, and it's absolutely one of the craziest underdog stories in any sport, period. Before the 2015 season even kicked off, Leicester wasn't exactly a favorite to win. In fact, many bookies and sports bettors had even gone as far as pricing in a relegation, much less a win. A Leicester win was priced in at a whopping 5,000-1 odds. And this wasn't entirely without reason. They had not only placed fairly low in previous seasons, but was also undergoing a manager switch at the start of the season. The season started out pretty good, but quickly got even better as Jamie Vardy would break the record for most consecutive games with a goal previously held by Ruud van Nistelrooy. They would later go on to beat most of the big clubs like Chelsea, Tottenham, Liverpool, and even Manchester City. Not only did they win the title, but they won it in a 10-point landslide. Some bookies who had betted against Leicester at the beginning of the season would lose up to £25 million, and some fans would make remarkable wins, cashing out over £100,000 from a mere £50 bet. So with that being said, I'm going all in on Haiti, baby. Let's go. Why? Because I know ball, that's why. The golden goal. An almost forgotten rule that was only ever used in a few matches. The golden goal was a tie-breaking method where the team who scored the first goal during the 30 minutes of extra time would win the match. Basically extra time sudden death. The golden goal was used in 2 Euros in 1996 and 2000, as well as 2 World Cups in 1998 and 2002, with the winners of the 2 Euros both being decided by golden goals. FIFA and UEFA are no stranger to experimenting with various rules to make the sport more engaging or fair, and it's something they absolutely should do, but the common consensus around the golden goal was mostly negative, and it was widely criticized for slowing down the game and incentivizing defensive play, and I am very much inclined to agree here. I personally think the idea of a golden goal sounds interesting on paper, but the reality is that some of the most tense and exciting moments throughout football history happen because of extra time desperation incentivizing aggressive and exciting risk-taking in players. There's one match in particular that's very well known for this, which I will talk about later. FIFA and UEFA later played around with an idea called the silver goal, where instead of a goal ending a match on the spot, it instead ended the match after the first period of extra time. If that team was still in the lead, of course. But that was also abandoned for similar reasons. Tiki-taka. This is a gameplay strategy developed by Johan Cruyff in the 80s, but the idea was later passed down and popularized by Pep Guardiola, and is one of the reasons why he's considered one of the best coaches of all time. The playstyle is very aggressive, focusing on possession, constant movement, and most notoriously, short and fast passing between players. The style reached its absolute apex between 2008 and 2012, with their most iconic practitioners to date being Xavi, Iniesta, and of course, Messi. Again, I can't show you any match footage, so if you want to see some high quality tiki-taka, I would recommend you watch the 2011 Champions League final between Barcelona and Manchester United. It's truly an amazing display. Critics of tiki-taka say that the strategy eventually grew stale over time, and with practitioners like Messi, Xavi, and Iniesta being some of the best players of all time, the strategy was pretty much bound for success. And yeah, I guess you can't really argue with the last part, but the 3 consecutive wins for Spain in the 2008 Euro, the 2010 World Cup, and the 2012 Euro would, in my opinion, at least suggest that it's an effective strategy. However, tiki-taka in most people's eyes fundamentally changed the way modern football is played, and it certainly had a major impact on strategy as well as team building in many clubs both at high and low level. Football memes. There's a lot of greatness here. So let's go over some of the best football memes and where they came from. Starting off with, "It can't go on like this, can it?" It can.
It can't go on like this, can it?
It can.
A legendary quote from former football player and now coach Mick McCarthy, who was asked by a reporter in 2023 about Blackpool's poor performance with just 1 win in 17 matches.
It can't go on like this, can it?
It can.
Then we have, "Chris, why are you laughing for? I'm being serious. I'm being serious."
Chris, why are you laughing for? Why are you laughing for? I'm being serious. I'm being serious.
Another great meme that originated from Liverpool fan James Redmond in 2017. Let's be honest, the accent is doing a lot here. Sadio Mane is the greatest football player in the world.
Sadio Mane. I said it last time I was on it, he's the best football player in the world. If your aunt had balls, she'd be your uncle, but she doesn't, so she's not. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
And I can't talk about football memes without at least mentioning Jose Mourinho. He's got so many iconic memes, but my personal favorite has to be, "I prefer not to speak. If I speak, I am in big trouble."
I prefer really not to speak. If I speak, I am in big trouble.
In March of 2014, when Aston Villa beat Mourinho's Chelsea, he was asked to comment on the referee's performance, who had given 2 red cards during the match. And he proceeded to give us one of the most iconic football memes of all time.
If I speak, I am in big trouble.
Ghana's Super Clash rivalry. Let me ask you something. What would happen if you took the previously mentioned El Clasico, injected it with dubious amounts of meth, and proceeded to light it on fire? Okay, maybe a bit of an exaggeration. But you would essentially get the super clash between Asante Kotoku and Accra Hearts of Oak in Ghana. And this is one of, if not the most hectic football rivalry in the world. Sometimes even more hectic than El Clasico itself. The rivalry dates back to the 1950s, just 1 year after Ghana's independence from the British, and out of 120 matches to date, Hearts of Oak have won 39 matches, while Asante Kotoku have won 40 times, and the rest of the matches have ended in ties, making it not only a hectic rivalry, but also an extremely close one. But the main reason it's on here is because of how unusually hectic this showdown can get. I talked about Ultras culture earlier, and Ghana has one of the worst out of all of them, as well as some of the largest stadium riots. The matches are hectic, not necessarily because the fans are more violent or anything, it's almost always because the security takes things way too far, and a good example of this is the Accra Sports Stadium disaster. In 2001, one of the worst stadium riots in football history took place during a Superclass showdown. It started with a couple of controversial referee decisions in the last minutes, which led to fans throwing trash onto the stadium. Now, instead of security trying to calm down the crowd, they instead responded by firing tear gas. Yeah. This obviously led to massive panic, and with an already overcrowded stadium, it led to 127 people dying due to a lack of oxygen and violent trauma. This remains one of the highest death counts related to stadium riots. Now, I think it's very important to clarify that just because Africa and Latin America has some of the largest stadium riots in history, it does not mean that the fans are more violent. It's almost always due to 3 factors: poor planning, poorly built stadiums, and poorly trained security. These issues have plagued these countries for decades, and fixing these problems is not as easy as just building a better stadium or training better security. However, that's a subject for another day. Origins of red and yellow cards. I mentioned the 1966 World Cup earlier, and it was one of the most brutal World Cups we've seen to date. Many players were injured, including the legendary Pelé. Due to the sheer amount of foul play in this World Cup, it led to a lot of confusion whenever players were sent off by the referee. This obviously made FIFA look for a solution to this problem, and they would find it with referee Ken Aston. 4 years prior to this, Ken Aston was the referee for what is considered the most violent match in football between Italy and Chile. This match was insane. There were several all-out brawls, too many fouls to count, and the police had to intervene on multiple occasions just to stop the fighting. The match would later be called the Battle of Santiago, and it honestly deserves its own entry, but all you really need to know is that this was the match that made Ken Aston come up with the idea of the red and yellow cards. Red and yellow cards were a universal solution. It bypassed any language barrier, and it was easy to understand. Ken Aston actually got the idea from driving past a traffic light, where yellow is obviously a warning and red is of course illegal. The idea would later be floated by FIFA, and they would make their first official appearance in the 1970 World Cup, and they've been a staple ever since. The player with the most yellow cards to date is Sergio Ramos. I think a lot of people could have guessed that one. The player with the most red cards is Colombian midfielder Gerardo Bedoya, with a whopping 46 red cards. Layer 5. Euro 2012. When it comes to the debate around the most controversial football tournament of all time, there's several answers you could go with. However, if you were to ask me, I'd put my money on the Euro 2012, and here's why. Even before the tournament began, there were already several issues with arenas being constructed. The Euro was held in Poland and Ukraine was still, even 4 years later, suffering from reeling effects of the 2008 financial crisis, making construction financing extra difficult. Couple that with Polish fans often being associated with racist behavior, an association that isn't completely unfounded, and you already knew that the joint venture would not get off to a good start, and to no one's surprise, it didn't. Shortly before the tournament even began, many EU countries and politicians decided to boycott Ukrainian matches due to the mistreatment of Ukrainian politician Yulia Tymoshenko while she was serving time in prison. Not only that, but Ukraine also received a lot of criticism for killing stray cats and dogs in order to clean up the streets before the tournament. And rightfully fucking so. But wait, I'm not done. About a month before the tournament even began, there was also an explosion in a major Ukrainian city that jeopardized the entire tournament even further. Once the tournament was actually underway, there were so many riots, protests, and fights that it's honestly hard to bring up all the incidents in one entry. And it was so much that many people just kind of wanted to get this Euro over with. Which, saying out loud, is just so sad and not at all what football is about, even though a lot of the criticisms are actually pretty valid. I mean, killing a bunch of cats and dogs just for a football tournament, you're basically asking for controversy at that point. The match that started a war. Football is an amazing sport with an unmatched ability to unify and bring people together. However, that's unfortunately not always the case. Now, I know from experience that this is a very sensitive topic for many Balkans, so please take this entry with a grain of salt. In 1990s Yugoslavia, tensions were already brewing even before the Civil War. Croatia had very recently had their first democratic election in 50 years, where the parties that favored Croatian independence had come out on top, and heavily opposed the communist leadership of Slobodan Milosevic. 5 weeks after this election, there would be a football match where Croatia's Dinamo Zagreb would go up against Serbia's Red Star Belgrade. It's important to note that these teams were a little bit more than just football teams at the time, and were honestly more akin to military organizations that just happened to play football. Even before the match even started, you had supporters shouting all kinds of things, so it obviously didn't take long before shit started hitting the fan. Fans started clashing almost immediately, and a riot quickly broke out before the match even started. This riot is believed by some to be the single biggest catalyst for the Civil War, while others argue that this is just a myth. Regardless of what you believe, there's no denying that it played a part, even though the part that it played might be a little bit exaggerated. Sadly enough, this is not the only time football started a war, and I'll talk about that later. Handball saves. Yes, despite the sport being called football, you would be surprised how often people actually use their hands. Most of the time it's unintentional, but sometimes it's the most blatant, I don't give a fuck, let's break the rules type shit you have ever seen, and I want to go over the most infamous ones. I talked about Maradona's Hand of God earlier, and it's probably the most well-known example regardless of how intentional it was. An infamous handball that probably wasn't intentional, at least from the looks of it, was Thierry Henry's handball against Ireland during a World Cup qualifying playoff in 2009. This match had a lot on the line. The winner would earn a place at the 2010 World Cup, and the loser would promptly be eliminated. The score was 1-1, and in the 103rd minute of extra time, Henry received a cross and very clearly mind you, used his left hand to control the ball right before assisting a French goal, making the final score a 2-1 win for France. This created a ton of outrage. Henry actually admitted to the fact that he used his hand, but just kind of dismissed it as a wrongful decision, which it certainly was. It doesn't really matter if this was intentional or not, since it obviously wouldn't happen today thanks to VAR, but you can't say the same for this last one. A handball that was so unbelievably intentional that it's hard not to laugh at it. We got Luis Suarez handball against Ghana in the 2010 World Cup semi-final. Just a couple months after Henry's handball, we had a very similar scenario in the actual World Cup. The score was 1-1, and in the final seconds of the match right before penalties, Ghana's Dominic Adia would have a goal-bound header, with Suarez being the only one standing in the way. In a moment of pure desperation, Suarez proceeded to push away the ball using his hands. Suarez would obviously be sent off with a red card, but Uruguay would actually win the match on penalties. A complete disregard for the rules, doing whatever it takes to get the win. I'm not gonna lie, a part of me kinda respects it. But Ghana very understandably didn't. This remains an open wound for many Africans, and understandably so. You can technically do something like this, but I certainly don't blame people for calling it cheating, because it kinda is. Serie A Femenil. Now, despite what the 2023 Women's World Cup would have you believe, women's football has actually come a fairly long way from where it started. Now, I've been slandering Italy a lot in this video, and rightfully so, but something that they actually did right is creating the first ever women's league. But, of course, not without its setbacks. Throughout 1930s Italy, football teams for women actually started to pop up all over the country, and the sport started to see some popularity. That was until the Italian National Olympic Committee prohibited women from participating in tournaments as well as friendly matches. Men, am I right? We can't help ourselves, can we? Did I just catch a woman having fun? Not on my watch. Anyways, the sport continued to be played, just unofficially. The first ever championship was later played in 1968, and the sport grew from there. It wasn't until 1986, however, when it was officially integrated with the Italian Football Federation. It's important to note that even though this was the first women's league, they still weren't aren't professionals. They played for decades with no real pay simply because they wanted to. Professionalism came very late and only became a thing very recently in the 2020s. So it's certainly not all sunshine and rainbows. Calciopoli. I guess we're going back to Italian corruption again. We know Italy is a corrupt country, and we know football is a corrupt sport. So what do you get if you put the two together? You get one of the biggest scandals Italian football has ever seen. In 2006, Italian prosecutors intercepted thousands of phone calls between officials from various Italian football clubs who were manipulating referee appointments to favor their specific club. The clubs that were most implicated in this were Juventus, AC Milan, Lazio, and Fiorentina, as well as many other clubs, but these were the standouts. What subsequently followed was a massive trial where clubs like AC Milan eventually got points deducted and demoted. But Juventus in particular would not only be relegated to Serie B, but also stripped of their previous league title. This is probably the most controversial part of the scandal, since many people considered this to be a severely disproportionate punishment, and I would be inclined to agree. The main reasoning for this was the fact that Juventus manager at the time, Luciano Moggi, was considered by prosecutors to be the main perpetrator of the scandal. But I personally don't think the entire club and all the players should suffer a much worse punishment because of that. Calciopoli stands out because of its severity, but they have a long-running issue with similar problems. It's very far from the only big scandal in Italian football, and it's a problem that's clearly bigger than just football. Essay allegations. The superstardom of football players is very reasonable since it's such a massive sport, but the fact that some players feel like they can get away with some pretty awful shit because of that is something that I unfortunately cannot ignore in this video. We got Karim Benzema, who got caught blackmailing his fellow French teammate Matteo Valbuena over a sex tape. While not assault per se, it's still an extremely alarming scandal that's not taken as seriously as it should be in my opinion. Dani Alves. The legendary Barcelona right back is a convicted sex offender, who was sentenced to 4 years in prison in 2023 for raping a woman, and released only a year later. Adam Johnson, convicted of grooming and raping a 15-year-old girl in 2015. Robinho, convicted of gang raping a 22-year-old woman in 2013, and there are many more instances like this that you probably already heard of. And these are the people that have been convicted. When it comes to accusations of rape, it's even worse, because this includes some of the biggest names out there. Neymar's been accused of rape, Mbappe's been accused of rape, and last but not least, I know I'm gonna get a lot of hate for this, but we need to talk about the accusations surrounding the most popular football player of all time, Cristiano Ronaldo. Ronaldo's been accused twice, once in 2005 and once in 2009. I just wanted to say that because even though none of these things are confirmed, I still think it's worth knowing because people tend to forget this stuff surprisingly quickly. Layer 6. The match of the century. The Miracle of Istanbul is one of the best and most intense football matches ever, and there are few matches that have reached the same legendary status. But one of those matches is the match of the century in 1970. During the World Cup that very same year, Italy went up against West Germany in the semi-finals, taking place in Mexico City. Italy scored in the first 10 minutes of the match, and the score stayed like that for 80 minutes. In the 70th minute, West German defender Franz Beckenbauer dislocated his shoulder, but since they had already used up all of their substitutes, he just kept playing. They don't make players like this anymore. In the very last minute of the match, however, it finally happened. West Germany scored, making the match go into extra time, and this is where it gets crazy. Italy and West Germany proceeded to score 4 goals in the span of 20 minutes, and while TV broadcasting was still replaying the last goal in the 111th minute, Italy proceeded to score the final goal, making it a 4-3 win for Italy. According to FIFA, it is estimated that 30 million Italians were watching this match as it aired live. For context, that was 60% of the Italian population at the time. I don't even want to speculate how they managed to keep their society moving during that time. Pierluigi Collina. We've talked about the greatest male player of all time, the greatest female player of all time, the greatest coach of all time, And now, it's time for what many people consider to be the greatest referee of all time, Pierluigi Collina. This bald Italian man with eyes that pierce your very soul is not only easy to recognize, but widely regarded as the GOAT of referees. But what makes him so good, you might ask? Well, despite being very much a no-nonsense kind of referee, even getting up in some player's face for talking back at him, there's actually very few people who have anything bad to say about him. He is known for having an exceptional sense of preparation before matches, and he believes that knowing as much as possible about the teams and their playstyle is crucial for making the best calls, and it's this particular dedication that earned him a lot of respect. He's appeared in all kinds of matches, but his two most famous appearances are probably the 1999 Champions League final and the 2002 World Cup final. He unfortunately retired in 2006 after a dispute with the Italian Football Federation about a sponsorship deal that they saw as a conflict of interest. Which is rich coming from the Italian Football Federation, by the way, but okay. But other than that, his career is looked on very fondly by players and fans alike. After his resignation, he eventually became the chairman of FIFA's referee committee, a position he still holds. He was also one of the spearheads for implementing VAR, so his impact on the football world is no joke, and he still remains a positive influence on the sport as a whole. Codification of the rules. If you've ever wondered when exactly football officially became the sport we all know and love today, then don't worry. I'm about to give you the answer. The version of the sport that exists today started out in England as an offshoot of rugby. During the 1800s, there were many different versions of the sport existing simultaneously with various local customs. That was until October 26, 1863, when representatives of various London football clubs came together and created the first ever governing body in football called the FA, or the Football Association, which still exists to this day. Over the next couple of months, the FA would draft the first ever written rules of the game. Most notably, they would separate the rules from that of rugby, so no more picking up the ball with your hands, for example. The rules would obviously be expanded on later, like with the previously mentioned offside in 1866, and the red and yellow cards much later on in 1970. But the FA would also later recognize the goalkeeper as an official role in 1871, the corner kick in 1872, and the penalty kick in 1891. So there's some history for you. Argentina's junta. Argentina is one of the most prominent football nations, but throughout some periods of Argentinian dominance in the sport, they've also gone through a lot of political unrest. About 60 years ago, Argentina would suffer arguably their worst period of political unrest they had ever seen, with military coup after military coup. So what brilliant decision do you think FIFA cooked up during that time? Why, having Argentina host the World Cup in 1978, of course. I mean, what could go wrong? Not only was there widespread match fixing in an attempt to make the country look good, but the military junta during that time oversaw the torture and disappearance of an estimated 30,000 opposers and left-wing activists. And oh yeah, the amount that the junta spent on organizing the World Cup contributed to one of the worst recessions the country had ever seen. The 1978 World Cup is one of the most well-known examples of sports being used to whitewash a national disaster, which FIFA was very good at back then. But that was 60 years ago. We're way past things like that, right? FIFA would never host the World Cup in back-to-back dictatorships in this day and age, right? Right? Futsal. Similar to how football is an offshoot of rugby, futsal is an offshoot of football, with origins tracing back to the 1930s. A physical education teacher in Uruguay named Juan Carlos Seriani needed a sport that could be played indoors on a basketball court. He wrote the first set of futsal rules in 1933, the game quickly spread through South America, and the rest is basically history. For those of you who don't know, futsal is pretty much football but indoors, and that might not sound like a big difference, but trust me, it is. The game is much more fast-paced than football, and since the ball is not only smaller but heavier, it also requires a much more technical skill with the ball itself. In fact, many legendary players who are widely known for their technical skill, like Ronaldinho, Neymar, and Messi, also played futsal growing up. When it comes to the sport itself, it's no surprise to anyone that Brazil and Argentina have dominated the sport for a very long time, and it's partly why Brazil and South America in general really has such a long-standing reputation of technical skill in football. Layer 7. The coin toss winner. It sounds like a joke, but it's not. Just imagine if this happened today. The semi-final of the 1968 European Championship between Italy and the Soviet Union ended in a 0-0 draw after extra time. Now here's the thing though, Elimination by penalty shootout was not yet introduced. There were penalty kicks, but it wasn't until 2 years later in 1970 that they would be used in elimination. So, how was the winner decided, you may ask? They used a coin toss. Yes, this was actually the official football rules, believe it or not, and many people even back then recognized how silly this actually was. The coin toss was made, Italy ended up going through to the final, and 2 years later, it was removed and replaced by penalties from 11 meters. Obviously a much more fair and deserving way to win a football match. Football as colonial resistance. There are fascinating and awe-inspiring examples of how football can actually be used to fight oppressive authority, and believe it or not, this is actually more common than you might think. Earlier, I touched on Barcelona fighting back against Fernando Franco's oppressive regime through football. Franco was actually a big proponent of suppressing the Catalan identity with Real Madrid and their players, utilizing their physical might in order to physically dominate Barcelona on the pitch. This is something that has strangely reflected how the teams play even to this day, with players like Ronaldo and Ramos being very physically dominant, while players like Messi and Neymar being more fast-paced and quick on their feet. Even though it's not colonial resistance, it's still an example of football being used to fight back against oppressive authority. The most dramatic example of colonial resistance through football is probably Algerian players breaking off from the French national team in 1958. Algeria was a French colony at the time, and this colonial resistance would later form the Algerian political party called the National Liberation Front. And this resistance spread to other French colonies as well, like Morocco and Tunisia. This is actually a very relevant topic because not only is France one of the more dominant nations when it comes to football, but many of their key players originally came from France's colonial territories. Players like Zidane, Vieira, Benzema, and so many more have received much pushback for very simple, understandable things, like not wanting to sing the French national anthem, for example. Colonialism is a dark spot in human history, and unfortunately, football has strong historic ties to colonialism. So players taking a public stance against those ties is completely understandable. Corruption. I decided to make this an entire entry simply because of the sheer amount of unpunished, blatant corruption in this sport, and even though there's corruption in pretty much every sport, football is simply next level. We got Calciopoli that I talked about earlier, but it's not like referee scandals is an Italy-specific thing, because similar things have happened in Bundesliga too, around the same time even. If there's one takeaway that I want you to have from this video, it's the fact that football is very corrupt. With everything from money laundering to bribery to match fixing to organized crime, football has seen all types of scandals. But the biggest football scandal, at least in recent times, is the scandal that I teased in the very beginning, and that is the 2015 FIFA-gate scandal. Before Infantino took over as the FIFA president, there was Sepp Blatter, who was somehow even more corrupt than Infantino. Blatter, along with Chuck Blazer and Jack Warner, the former heads of the American Football Confederation, legendary player Michel Platini, and over 24 FIFA officials were implicated in a multi-decade-long self-enrichment scheme receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes. Some was for advertising rights, some was for votes, but the most central ones for this particular scandal were bribes relating to the hosting rights of the 2018 and 2022 World Cup, giving them to back-to-back dictatorships. Now get this, as all of you probably know, even after all of this came out, both Russia and Qatar still hosted the World Cup. The worst part about this scandal isn't necessarily the bribes themselves, it's the fact that these slimy suits are willing to compromise so many people's lives aiding these dictatorial regimes. And not just suits, but legendary players too. Bossman ruling. Football has in many ways become bloated with unimaginable sums of money, leading to clubs spending ridiculous amounts in any desperate attempt to acquire the latest hot player on the market. This is in stark contrast to how it was before the Bosman ruling in 1995. This was an EU court decision that had massive effects on football transfers. I'm not gonna bore you with the legal semantics of the decision, but essentially, this court ruling was made in consolidation with 3 different legal cases involving Belgian player Jean-Marc Bosman. Bosman wanted to move from the Belgian club RFC Liège to French club US Dunkirk. Now, despite his contract having already expired, RFC Liège demanded a transfer fee, which US Dunkirk did not want to pay. So Bosman, essentially being trapped to a club he did not want to be a part of, ended up taking this to court, and a couple years later, the court ended up ruling in his favor and dramatically shifted the power balance between players and clubs. This ruling gave much more financial freedom to players, which is great. It meant that players had more leverage and could essentially charge more for transfers with a much larger percentage of club profits going to the players. But it also incentivized clubs to create longer contracts, essentially tying players to clubs for longer periods of time, which, depending on how you look at it, could be both good and bad. A negative impact of this ruling was that it massively widened the gap between clubs. It meant that smaller clubs could lose their top players much easier to clubs that could pay for the transfer. I personally think more financial freedom to players is a good enough boon for the Bosman ruling to have a net positive impact on the sport. But I do think it's worth your time as a football fan to look into the Bosman ruling and how it affected the football economy. Mussolini's World Cup fix. We've talked about various controversies and scandalous events in football history, and we already know FIFA is drawn to dictatorships like moths to a flame, but this one is probably the most egregious out of all of them, because not only has fascism made a profound impact on many aspects of our modern day lives, but it's also made an impact on football. Fascist Italy was known for many things. Being fair and democratic was not one of them, and a first-hand example of this was the 1934 World Cup held in Italy. Many years after this particular World Cup, more and more Italian officials started coming out with horrific stories of Benito Mussolini manipulating the tournament behind the scenes. He personally selected referees for the Italian matches, had what many players suspected to be ineligible Argentinian players playing for Italy, and also bribed countries like Greece, for example, before the qualifying match against Italy. But the worst part about Mussolini's involvement is probably the threats he made behind the scenes. In preparation of this particular World Cup in Italy, Giorgio Vaccaro, the head of the Italian Football Federation at the time, was summoned by Mussolini, where he bluntly told him that Italy needs to win the World Cup. Not should win, but needs to win. You can probably guess what he was insinuating there. He made similar remarks to the coach and the players, telling them that they either win or... I should probably mention that none of this is confirmed, at least not according to anything I found, but let's be honest, it's not that far-fetched to assume that this is probably accurate. Italy would in fact go on to win this World Cup, but I suspect it wasn't without a little outside intervention. Layer 8. The origins of football. Even though the British were the ones who officially established football as a sport, they did not come up with it. In fact, it's been around for about 2,500 years. There's actually been many versions of football throughout history, but according to FIFA, the first iteration of football, called Cuju, was created during the Ming Dynasty in ancient China. The purpose of Cuju was originally to train soldiers for better fitness and coordination in combat, but quickly made its way into the Chinese imperial court, becoming somewhat of a staple in Chinese culture. So yeah, football has existed for thousands of years. Honestly, the fact that the human impulse to kick a round object has existed for as long as it has says a lot about our species. First televised match. Arsenal is a team that is clowned on relentlessly today, and for good reason. But the team actually has some historical relevancy. The first televised football match wasn't a high-profile game or anything, but rather an arranged friendly between Arsenal and their youth academy in 1936. It was broadcasted by the BBC and only for about 15 minutes before it had to be cancelled due to an upcoming storm. This was kind of a field test for TV broadcasting, since a full international match between England and Scotland would take place only a year later, with the full match being broadcasted live. Ironically enough though, Arsenal is no stranger to completing broadcasting milestones. They were playing in the first radio broadcast, the first interactive match, and the first 4K match. But let's be honest, Arsenal's probably more entertaining now than they've ever been. Imagine starting up the TV back then and seeing this shit. I wouldn't be able to look away. The murder of Andres Escobar. Let me ask you something. What do you think happens when a player performs worse than expected? Well, in most cases, you're just gonna have a bunch of disappointed fans, or in some cases, maybe a career shortfall. Unfortunately, that is not what happened to Colombian player Andres Escobar. Colombia has gone through a lot of violence and political turmoil, especially at the height of Pablo Escobar's power. But even after his death in 1993, the cartels still ruled pretty much much the entire country, including the football clubs and the players. This takes us to the 1994 World Cup. Colombia had actually performed pretty well in the run-up to the World Cup, and was actually one of the favorites to win the entire thing. But that sentiment would quickly turn sour as Colombia will go on to lose against America in the group stage, relegating them in the process. Andres Escobar, who unfortunately opened up the match with an own goal, was almost single-handedly blamed for the relegation, making him very unpopular at home in Colombia. So a couple days later, with the tournament still ongoing, Escobar was sadly shot and killed on the orders of a Colombian drug syndicate, who had apparently lost a lot of money gambling on the tournament. It's a scary example of how an honest mistake in a corruption-riddled sport can lead to devastating consequences. The football war. Earlier, I talked about Red Star Belgrade versus Dinamo Zagreb possibly starting the Yugoslavian War in 1990, and while it's still heavily debated by historians whether or not it actually started the war, this match that I'm going to talk about right now actually started a war. La Guerra de Football, also known as the 100-Hour War, was a conflict between El Salvador and Honduras in 1969 after Honduras failed to qualify for the 1970 World Cup. Even though football is what triggered the conflict itself, there were obviously a couple of root causes for why this became so violent so fast. The main one being immigration. With El Salvador's immense population density, the country has historically had a lot of issues around land being so scarce. So it certainly didn't help when Honduras did in Israel pretty much and enacted a bunch of land reforms, displacing many El Salvadorians in the process. So there was already a lot of tension before the matches even started. Now after the 3 qualifying matches which led to El Salvador moving on to the World Cup, it was then followed by tons of riots that quickly escalated into all-out war. Thousands of people died in a very short amount of time, with untold damage to infrastructure, including oil storage facilities, which caused America to quickly intervene, ending the conflict after 100 hours. Never mess with America's oil, I guess. The Christmas Truce Match. I wanted to finish off the iceberg with an entry that actually showcases what a beautiful sport football really is. World War I was one of the most horrific conflicts in modern history. Millions of people died, and millions more were injured both physically and mentally. However, despite the horrific sights witnessed by all soldiers on the Western Front, football is still one of those magical things that bring people together in mysterious ways. On Christmas Day in 1914, during a ceasefire between the Allies and the Germans, both sides got up from their respective trenches and started playing football in no man's land. The historical accounts of this are a bit murky, but there are accounts of matches being played between the British and the Germans, with the Germans allegedly coming out on top. The ceasefire then ended just a couple days later, and within a month, the fighting resumed as normal. So even though football is corrupt and often taken way too seriously, historical moments like that proves why the sport means so much to so many people. And that's the iceberg. I hope you enjoy this year's World Cup, and hopefully it won't be as controversial as the previous one, right? Before I go, I wanted to give a shout out to Vize on YouTube, since his several football iceberg videos coupled with my excitement for this year's World Cup is essentially the reason for why I wanted to make this video to begin with. So shout out to him, and take 5.